She begged to trade her baby for bread, but the rancher said nothing, then took both. The land was quiet that evening, quiet in the way a graveyard is quiet, where every sound feels borrowed from something already dead. The sun bled itself out over the far horizon, a wounded ember sinking behind the buttes. Wind ran restless fingers through the brittle grass, carrying with it the dry rattle of seeds and the faintest echo of coyotes testing their lungs for the night. Elias' heart rode slow, the leather of his saddle creaking beneath him, his horse's hooves muffled in the dust. His hat brim shadowed eyes that had not known softness in years. He was a man of edges and silence, cut down to bone by a war nobody remembered, scarred by choices he had buried like corpses in the sand. He spoke little, carried less, and trusted nothing but the ground under his boots and the iron at his hip. As his ranch rose out of the dusk, small against the endless plain, he felt no warmth. Home was just walls and timber. Inside, nothing waited. No voice, no laughter, only shadows. But tonight, something sat waiting on his porch, a figure, frail as if the wind itself might carry her away. A woman. Her dress clung to her in tatters, fabric torn and dirt-stained. Her hair hung loose, tangled with dust, strands sticking to her damp face. And in her arms, a bundle. A child. Elias slowed his horse. The air thickened. The creak of leather, the sigh of the wind. Even the cry of coyotes. All hushed, as though the earth held its breath. The woman rose unsteadily, her knees buckling before she caught herself against the porch rail. Her lips parted, cracked like dry riverbeds, voice no more than a whisper carried by desperation. Bread. Elias dismounted, boots sinking into the dirt. He stood a few paces away, a shadow against the dying sun. She looked at him then, eyes wild, fevered, gleaming with something between terror and hope. She lifted the bundle as though it weighed nothing. Her voice broke. "Take him. Please, bread, just bread," the baby whimpered, a frail cry that cut through the silence sharper than any bullet. Elias's jaw tightened. His hand hovered at his belt, not for the gun, but for steadiness. He had heard cries like that once before, long ago, in fields of smoke and fire, when men died calling for mothers who would never come. He said nothing. The woman staggered forward, falling to her knees on the step. She clutched the child tighter, rocking him, her sobs breaking the stillness. "Please, he won't last. Take him, take both. Do what you want. Just bread." The silence was heavy, pressing, like thunder that refuses to break. Elias's breath came slow, rough, dragging through lungs scarred by years of dust and gunpowder. His eyes, dark and hollow, studied the woman. Her trembling hands, her skin stretched thin over bone, the defiance still clinging to her even in ruin. Still, he said nothing. Instead, he turned. Boots thudded against the porch boards as he pushed the door open and disappeared inside. The woman let out a choked cry, thinking he had rejected her. Another door closed, another hand turned away. But moments later, the hinges groaned again. Elias stepped out, carrying half a loaf of bread. He set it down on the porch rail, between them, like an offering or a bargain struck in silence. The woman's eyes flooded with tears. She reached, hesitant as though afraid it would vanish. The baby stirred, tiny fists brushing the night air. She tore a piece of the bread and pressed it to her lips, moaning low as though tasting life itself for the first time in days. Elias watched. The wind hissed across the barren yard. His face betrayed nothing, yet something in his chest shifted, an ache long buried, pried open by the sight of a woman clinging to survival and a child too fragile for this land. Then, without a word, Elias bent and lifted the woman by her elbow. She flinched at his touch, stiff as a cornered animal, but he only guided her up the steps, steady as stone. He opened his door wider, the dim interior yawning like the mouth of a cave. Shadows flickered from the hearth inside. With the same silence, he gestured her in, not with words, not with comfort, only a motion of his hand, rough and unyielding. The woman hesitated, clutching the baby, her eyes darting toward the dark interior as though it were both salvation and trap. She looked back at him, searching his face for intent. She found nothing but the unreadable stillness of a man too long alone. Slowly, she stepped inside. Elias followed, the door closing heavy behind them. The ranch sank into silence again. save for the faint whimper of a child carried into the shadows of a house that had not known such sound in years. And in that silence lingered the question, the one that would not leave her mind, nor the minds of any who might hear this tale later. What kind of man takes bread to the hungry, but then takes both the woman and the child as well? Savior? Captor? Or something darker still? The door shut heavy behind her, sealing out the fading light, sealing her into another kind of darkness. The cabin smelled of smoke and wood oil, a place worn by one man's silence. The hearth glowed faint, fire burned low, embers pulsing like a tired heart. Clara stood just inside, the child tight to her chest. Her eyes darted, taking in the room as though every shadow might spring alive. Sparse things met her gaze, a rifle mounted clean and ready on the wall, boots left neatly by the door, a single chair worn smooth by years of use, and a table that bore the scars of knives and solitude. No softness, no laughter, no life. Elias moved past her without a word, his boots whispering against the wood. He crouched by the hearth, feeding the fire with slow, practiced hands. The flames licked upward, casting his face into lines sharp as carved stone. Clara lowered herself into the chair, trembling. Her stomach clenched as the smell of bread still lingered on her tongue. Hunger hollowed her, but fear gnawed deeper. She rocked the baby gently, his weak whimper breaking the silence. Elias rose, fetched a cup, filled it with water from a tin basin, and set it on the table before her. No words, no glance. Then he sat against the far wall, arms crossed, hat shadowing his eyes, as if guarding a fire that had nothing to do with wood and flame. Clara drank greedily, the water running down her chin. She tore another piece from the bread and pressed it to her lips, chewing with reverence, as if each bite might vanish if she dared savor it too slowly. The baby stirred, crying thinly. She hushed him with a trembling hand. Her eyes lifted, searching the rancher's face for meaning, for intent. But Elias gave nothing back, just the slow rise and fall of his chest, steady as the ticking of a clock. The silence in the cabin grew thick, pressing against her ears. Outside, the wind hissed across the plains, slipping through the cracks in the walls. It carried voices, whispers she could not name, voices that seemed to judge her for stepping into this man's world. That night stretched like a noose. Clara lay curled on the floor by the hearth, baby cradled in her arms, warmth from the fire brushing their faces. She did not sleep. She listened, the baby's breath, soft, shallow, like the sigh of leaves skittering across stone. The creak of boots, Elias moving in the shadows, each step measured, soundless yet heavy. The moan of wind pressing at the walls, rattling loose boards like ghostly fingers. Every sound was magnified. Every breath a reminder she was not alone, though loneliness still clung to her bones. Fear whispered, "You traded hunger for danger. You may have given yourself to something worse than death." She dared not speak. His silence gnawed more than hunger ever had. It was not cruel nor kind. It was unreadable, and that frightened her most. The night finally broke under the gray pallor of dawn. Clara's eyes opened to light creeping between the boards, casting pale bars across the floor. For a moment she thought it had been a dream, the bread, the fire, the man. But then she smelled something new, warmth, fresh and sweet. On the table sat bread, baked again. A jar of milk, cool from the well. Her lips parted in disbelief. She looked around. The cabin was empty. Through the window she saw him, Elias Hart, already in the corral, shoulders bent against the labor of mourning. He moved with a steady rhythm, tossing hay, checking the horses, every motion marked by strength honed and hardened. The sun painted him gold for a moment, but his face remained shadowed, unreadable as ever. Clara held the baby tighter, torn by the weight of her choices. He had given her food, given her fire, given her roof. But men do not give such things freely. Not in this land. Not in any land. She pressed her forehead to her child's, whispering so softly the wind stole her words before they reached the air. "What price will he ask of us?" Her voice broke, and the baby whimpered in answer. The fire crackled low. Outside, Elias stood tall against the corral fence, his back a wall she could not see beyond. Shelter had been granted, but at what cost? Only the shadows of his house seemed to know. And in those shadows, Clara felt the first stirrings of a truth more frightening than hunger. Safety itself could be a kind of prison. The days stretched long beneath a sun that showed no mercy. Each dawn brought the hiss of wind pushing across the plains, rattling the shutters, carrying dust through the cracks. The world outside seemed endless and unforgiving. Inside, the cabin was little different. Silence pressed against its walls, silence thick enough to make breathing feel like intrusion. Elias moved through that silence as if it were armor. His words were few, his gestures measured. He rose with the light, worked until dark, returned to the cabin only to stoke the fire, mend what was broken, and retreat again into stillness. Clara watched him, trying to read the man behind the silence, but found only stone. The baby was the only sound in that house, soft cries, restless breaths, and sometimes a weak giggle that startled even Clara. One morning, as Elias stood at the doorway, shoulders broad against the light, the baby reached a hand toward him, lips curving into something fragile and new. A smile. Elias froze. The hardness of his face flickered just for an instant. His eyes softened, as though he had forgotten how to shield them. Clara saw it. She held her breath, afraid even to blink. But just as quick, his expression shuddered, stone walls rebuilt. He turned away, boots heavy against the floorboards. Still, the moment lingered. Clara could not unsee it. One afternoon, as she gathered washed rags by the fire, Elias lifted his shirt to wipe the sweat from his brow. For the first time, she saw what lay beneath, his back, scored with old scars, some jagged like lightning strikes, others neat, straight, the lash of a whip. Burn marks too, raw once but long since healed into twisted patches of flesh. Her breath caught. These were not the wounds of accident. They were the history of a man who had lived through chains, through cruelty. A man who had once been broken and yet stood still. Clara looked away before he noticed, but the image branded itself into her mind. That night she could not sleep. When she closed her eyes, she saw scars across his back like rivers carved into a wasteland. She wondered what kind of hell he had endured. What betrayal had carved those lines into him. The air between them thickened in those days. She feared him still, feared the cost of his shelter, yet pity gnawed at the edges of her fear. Sometimes their eyes met across the table, or through the firelight. They never spoke, but those silences screamed. Her gaze asked questions she dared not voice. His gaze warned her away, yet begged her not to. The baby grew stronger, cheeks filling out, eyes brightening. At times, laughter escaped his lips, sharp, sudden, pure. The sound startled the cabin itself, as though walls long used to echoing only silence and sorrow had forgotten such music. Clara's heart swelled with it. Elias's face, too, changed for just a heartbeat, as though the laugh pulled him back to something lost. One evening, clouds rolled over the plains, swollen with storm. The sky turned the color of bruises, the air charged and restless. Thunder grumbled in the distance, deep and threatening. Elias sat sharpening his knife, the rasp of steel against stone steady, calm, while outside the world held its breath. Clara sat near the hearth, her child asleep in her arms. She stared at Elias, at the set of his jaw, the scars peeking where his shirt dipped low. The question had lived in her chest for days, clawing, demanding. At last, the storm outside gave her courage. Her voice was low, barely louder than the crackle of fire. "Why take us?" The knife stopped. His hand froze mid-motion. For a long time he did not look up. Thunder rolled closer, rattling the window panes. Clara thought he might never answer, thought her words would fall dead into the silence as all others had. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes found hers, dark, hollow, filled with something broken and raw. When he spoke, his voice was gravel, rough from disuse, but every word cut deep. Didn't want to hear a child cry. His jaw worked, a muscle twitching as he swallowed hard, like I once did. The storm broke then, rain hammering the roof, wind howling like wolves around the cabin. Clara's breath hitched. Her arms tightened around the child. His words sank into her bones. He had been that child, alone, crying into a world that had no mercy, and no one had come for him. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her. The fear she carried twisted into something heavier, something she could not yet name. Pity, sorrow, maybe even recognition. She too had known hunger, abandonment, the cruelty of silence. Elias dropped his gaze, returning to his blade, though his hand trembled once before steadying. The fire snapped loud, sparks rising, shadows dancing on scarred walls. Clara watched him, heart torn, questions multiplying but none finding voice. The storm raged on, yet inside the cabin the silence returned, thicker than before, heavy with truths that once spoken could never be unsaid. The days had taken on a fragile rhythm, bread rising in the oven, fire crackling at dusk, Elias's boots thudding across the dirt as he worked the corral. Clara almost began to believe this silence could last, that the wind's whispers would remain only whispers. But peace in the west is a mirage. And mirages vanish. It began with the sound, distant, low, like thunder rolling where no storm brewed. Hooves, 4, 5, maybe more. Clara stood in the doorway, child pressed to her chest, and saw them crest the rise, riders, dust pluming around them, silhouettes cut against the setting sun. Her stomach dropped. She knew by the way they sat their saddles, by the steel glinting in their hands. Not neighbors, not drifters, wolves. Elias stepped out from the barn, wiping sweat from his brow. He saw them too. His jaw set, hard as granite. Without a glance back he spoke, his voice low, rough, the first she'd heard in days. Sighed. Now, Clara obeyed. She clutched the baby, heart pounding as she ducked into the cabin, the door left ajar enough to see through. She crouched low, rocking the child, whispering useless comfort against his soft hair. The riders came fast, dust curling around them like ghosts of men long dead. Their leader, a broad man with eyes like ice chips, reined in hard. Horses snorted, pawed the earth, restless. Elias Hart, the leader called, voice carrying sharp in the dry air. Didn't think we'd find you hiding on this patch of dirt. Elias stood still, hands loose at his sides. He looked smaller against their number, yet the ground beneath him seemed steadier for his boots. His silence stretched, and in that silence Clara felt fear coil tighter than any rope. The leader smirked. Deserter, outlaw, blood on your hands. You thought running would wash it clean? He spat into the dust. There's a price on you, Hart, dead or breathing. Makes no difference, the baby whimpered. A sound too soft for such a world, but Clara clutched him tighter, praying the riders did not hear. Elias finally moved. His hand brushed his coat aside, revealing the iron at his hip. Not a boast. Not a threat, just fact. His voice came low, gravel dragged over stone. Best ride on. The air thickened, hot as the breath before lightning. Dust swirled around the horse's legs, coiling like spirits hungry for blood. The leader's laugh broke the tension. Men, take him! It happened fast. Guns cleared leather, muzzles flaring, cracks of thunder splitting the air. Clara flinched, clutching her child, ears ringing as bullets chewed into wood. Elias moved with the desperation of a man who had no choice but to stand. His revolver barked, sharp, precise. One rider fell hard, dust swallowing his cry. The others scattered, firing wild. Horses screamed, dirt tore beneath hooves. The yard became chaos, dust, blood, smoke. Elias took a round to the shoulder but did not falter. He fought with the grimness of one who had faced death before, and would face it again if it meant shielding what was now his. From the cabin, Clara pressed against the wall, whispering prayers that burned her lips. She peered out once and saw him, Elias. Blood streaking his arm, teeth bared against pain, eyes burning with something fiercer than survival. And then silence. The last rider turned and fled, his horse kicking up a trail of dust into the dying light. The yard lay scattered with broken bodies. The smell of gunpowder clung heavy in the air. Elias staggered, knees threatening to buckle. His revolver clattered to the ground. Clara rushed out before fear could stop her. She found him on his knees, blood soaking his shirt. The lantern light from the cabin spilled over them, painting him in gold and shadow. Her hands trembled as she pressed cloth to the wound, her breath ragged. "Hold still," she whispered, though her voice cracked. He did not speak. His eyes half-lidded found hers. For the first time she saw past the silence, saw the weight he carried, the sins, the betrayals, the endless miles of regret. He was both savior and sinner, protector and danger. She worked by lantern glow, binding his wound, her fingers brushing his skin, rough and fever-hot. Each touch unraveled the fear she had clung to, replacing it with something heavier, deeper. The baby stirred inside the cabin, but Clara did not move. Her eyes stayed on Elias, on the man who had killed to keep them breathing. The silence between them grew thick again, but it was no longer hollow. It was full of things unsaid, of questions neither dared voice, of need too dangerous to name. For the first time, Clara felt safer in his brokenness than she ever had in the wide, merciless world beyond his door. It began as a line on the horizon, thin as a scar against the evening sky. At first, Clara thought it no more than sunset playing tricks. But then the wind shifted, carrying with it a smell sharp and merciless. Smoke. Elias was already outside, eyes narrowed against the glow. He did not need to tell her what it meant. The prairie was burning, and fire out here was hungrier than wolves, faster than bullets. The sky darkened as smoke bled into it, thick and choking. Flames danced along the grasslands, spreading wild, a beast unleashed. Clara clutched the baby to her chest, the child coughing against the acrid air. "Barn first," Elias barked. Already moving, Clara followed, skirts whipping in the wind. Sparks snapping past like red-eyed demons. The cattle bawled in panic, hooves striking dirt as Elias drove them, shouting rough commands drowned by the roar of fire. Clara fumbled with gates, her hands raw, lungs tearing for breath. The baby's cries mingled with the chaos, thin and helpless against the storm of flame. Clara laid him in a trough damp with water, covering him with wet cloth, praying it would keep him safe. Then she turned back, heart hammering. The barn loomed, timbers creaking as embers bit into its roof. Elias climbed the ladder with a bucket, hurling water into a blaze that only laughed, only grew. Clara dragged what she could, blankets, feed sacks, anything that might burn too fast. The fire pressed closer. The world turned to smoke and fury. Clara's throat scorched. Her eyes wept tears she could not spare. She stumbled, coughing, and her foot caught on a fallen beam. The ground gave way beneath her. Flames clawed at her skirts, heat licked her skin. She screamed, scrambling, but the blaze rushed to devour her. A hand seized her. Strong, unyielding. Elias. He yanked her clear, pulling her into his chest. His body wrapped around hers, shielding her from the inferno. She could feel the hammer of his heart, the roughness of his breath as he held her tight against the world's end. For a moment, the fire was not the only thing that burned. Their faces were inches apart, smoke curling between them like fate itself. Clara's lips parted on a breath she could not take. Elias's eyes, fierce even through soot and pain, met hers with something unspoken, something forbidden. Desire flickered in the chaos, raw and reckless. It was born not of gentleness, but of survival, of being dragged back from the jaws of death into the arms of a man who had already saved her life more times than she could count. Then he let go. Always too soon! Move!" he growled, shoving her toward the cabin. His voice was ragged, torn by smoke, but it cut through the haze like iron. The night raged on. Together they fought, buckets, shovels, sweat and blood, but the fire was bigger than them. By the time the horizon paled to gray, by the time dawn bled across the sky, the prairie lay in ruin. The herd was gone. The barn was ash. Blackened earth stretched farther than the eye could follow, a wasteland where life had been only hours before. Clara stood in the doorway. The baby pressed against her shoulder, his small body trembling with every cough. She turned her head and saw Elias in the field, standing amid the smoke like a man carved from its shadows. His shoulders slumped, his hat gone, soot clinging to the sweat on his face. For once his mask cracked. She saw it. The tears hidden in the grit, the grief he tried to bury beneath silence. He had built this place with his own hands, and the fire had taken it in a single night. Clara stepped toward him, baby clutched close. The crunch of her boots drew his gaze. He wiped at his face quickly, but not quickly enough. She had already seen. She did not speak. Words were useless here, trinkets too small to lay upon such ruin. Instead, she simply stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, their silence heavy as the smoke still rising from the fields. The baby stirred, blinking through soot-crusted lashes. His tiny hand reached out, groping blindly, and found Elias's finger. The hardened man froze. His eyes dropped to the fragile fist clutching him, clinging as though to a lifeline. He looked up then, at Clara, at the child, at the ruins of everything he had been. Clara's heart twisted. The sight was too much, too tender and too cruel. Here was a man stripped bare, A man who had lost everything yet was chosen in silence by the smallest of hands. She felt her chest swell with something vast, terrifying. Hope, need, love, though the word itself seemed too dangerous to whisper. Her heart broke at the same time it bloomed. For she knew the world would never forgive them. Her a widow not yet free. Him an outlaw scarred by sins he could never wash away. But standing there, in the ashes of the plains, with the baby's hand binding them together, Clara also knew one truth more certain than any law. They were bound now. Fire had taken the land, but it had forged something between them no flame could consume. The fire had eaten much, but not everything. In its wake, the plains whispered again, softer than before, as if testing their own breath. Ash stretched for miles, but from it, small green shoots pushed up stubbornly, tiny rebellions against ruin. Flowers bent their heads through blackened soil, fragile yet unbroken. Clara stood at the cabin door, the baby against her chest. The morning air still smelled of smoke, but beneath it came something gentler. Dew on burned grass, the faint sweetness of life insisting on itself. Elias sat on the porch, shoulders hunched, hat in his hands. His body bore new wounds, scratches, burns, bruises painted like fresh scars across old ones. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as if the fire might return, and he meant to meet it first. When Clara approached, he did not turn. His voice was low, raw. "You need to take the boy." "And go." The words struck colder than the wind. Clara froze, the baby stirring in her arms. "Why?" she whispered. Elias's jaw tightened. He stared at the earth as if the truth were carved there. "'Cause what I touch don't last. This land, my herd, everything I've tried to hold burns, breaks, or dies. You deserve more than a ghost, Clara." His hand trembled around the brim of his hat. His voice cracked when he added, "That child deserves more than me." For a long moment, only the wind answered. It swept through the empty corral, rattled the blackened fence posts, sighed across the open plain. Clara felt the weight of his grief pressing on her chest, heavy enough to steal her own breath. Slowly, she lowered herself to the porch beside him. She placed the baby gently in his arms. The child stirred, eyes fluttering open, and one tiny hand reached for Elias's shirt, gripping it with quiet certainty. Clara's voice was steady, though her heart thundered. "He already calls you father." Elias looked down at the boy, his breath hitching. The small face, round with innocence, turned into him as if the hardened lines of his chest were the safest place in the world. The child's weight was light, but to Elias it seemed to anchor him to the earth for the first time in years. His throat closed. For a moment he could not breathe, could not speak. His eyes, rimmed red with smoke and sleeplessness, filled with something he had long denied himself, tenderness. He lifted his gaze to Clara. She did not flinch under it. Her face was pale, streaked with soot and weariness, but her eyes held him steady. There was no fear there now, only choice. The silence stretched, thick and fragile, until Elias finally let it break. His voice was a rasp, torn from someplace deep. "I don't know how to be that." Clara reached out, resting her hand lightly over his scarred knuckles, where the baby's fist still clung. "You already are." The sun began to climb then, spilling gold across the blackened earth. Light touched the porch, catching in Elias's hair, glinting on Clara's eyes. The world was still broken, but in that dawn, it looked less cruel. Elias leaned back against the post, the child against his chest. His breath came slow, deep, as though some knot inside him had loosened. Clara sat beside him, shoulders brushing his, the silence between them no longer hollow, but whole. They did not speak again. They did not need to. Hours passed in that quiet. The baby slept, rising and falling with Elias's breath. Clara leaned her head against the porch rail, eyes drifting shut, her body at last allowed to rest. The wind moved through the grasslands, carrying with it the promise of rain. Somewhere a meadowlark sang, fragile but sure, and the sky widened above them, vast and forgiving. Elias closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the silence inside him was not a burden. It was a balm. He felt the weight of Clara at his side, the warmth of the boy against his chest, and knew that redemption did not come in words or deeds or absolution. It came in presence, in staying when every scar told him to leave. He was no savior, no outlaw, no ghost. He was simply here, and for them, For her, that was enough. When the sun reached its height, Clara stirred. She looked out across the scarred prairie and saw not ruin, but rebirth. She imagined crops planted where ash lay now, cattle lowing in fields reborn with green. A home rebuilt from char and stone. She turned to Elias. He had fallen asleep upright. The baby curled against him, their breaths matched. The sight stole hers for a moment. Man and child, bound by something deeper than blood. Clara's lips trembled into a smile, small but unshakable. She reached out, brushing soot from Elias's cheek with her fingertips. He stirred but did not wake. The porch creaked. The planes exhaled. Life, quiet and stubborn, carried on. As the camera of the world might pull back, it would show them there. 3 figures on a weathered porch, framed by endless sky and land scarred yet healing. The fire had not destroyed them. It had forged them. The vast horizon stretched, golden under the sun. The wind carried the sound of new life across it. Not thunder, not gunfire, not cries of loss, but the simple breathing of a family remade. The story ended not in fury, nor in sorrow, but in peace.